Hare Krishna, everyone. This is acyuta-bhava from Nightlight Astrology. I'm fielding another great question today that you guys sent me. And this one has to do with cultural appropriation within yoga. I thought this was a really good one. So this person wrote this, that they've been doing mantra meditation regularly and that it's been really helping them. But then they wrote this: I keep coming up against a barrier, and that is that I feel like an imposter, despite the fact that I believe all religion is pointing to the same thing. And so it doesn't matter what religion you practice, because this specific practice doesn't come from my cultural lineage. I feel like I am appropriating it when it doesn't belong to me or my heritage. I recognize in myself that I inadvertently judge others for this reason, not only myself. And I wonder whether you've ever felt this way. And if so, how do you reconcile that? Do the scriptures ever talk about such a situation? Is it acceptable to select aspects or practices of the philosophy that suit you, or would that be sacrilegious, so to speak? So really good questions, such good questions, and ones that I think a lot of people who get really immersed into Bhakti Yoga have to consider at one point or another, or anyone who gets into yoga. If you go far enough with it beyond, say, a studio asana practice, where you're just in maybe an urban setting of some kind, you're just doing yoga classes. If you go further with it, you develop a relationship with a guru, you enter into a parampara, disciplic succession. You're starting to study certain scriptural tradition, like that. Like, you're definitely going to run into, if you're a Western-bodied person, it's a phrase that we often use in Bhakti Yoga, an Indian-bodied person, is maybe not going to run into the same things that a Western-bodied person is when it comes to the cultural apparatus of yoga. But what I want to say is a few things about how you can deal with this. And this comes directly from my teachers, and also from, remember the fact that my spiritual community, when I'm meeting and gathering with people in practice of Bhakti Yoga, I would say 75% of my community are Indian bodied devotees, which means that they were born, culturally raised in India. What is yoga, and why isn't it just a cultural or foreign religion or something like that? First of all, because that's yoga philosophy, the texts of yoga philosophy, whether you're looking at, Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, or you're looking at the Bhagavatam or the Bhagavad Gita, classic texts of Bhakti Yoga, even, to a certain extent, the Upanishads and so forth. There is no claim that this is a religion, but that this is a technique, and that as a technique, it constitutes, Sanatan Dharma, which is to say eternal Dharma, the eternal truths of religious experience. And that yoga in the Bhagavad Gita is something that comes, in a sense, to challenge the caste superiority, and to some extent the Vedic and Brahminical elitism that existed in India. Yoga philosophy is an explanation of techniques of religious experience that are eternal and that transcend class, gender, sex, creed, and that's how they're presented, especially in the Gita. And so the really revolutionary thing about yoga is that while it comes from India, in a sense, it's like a spiritual, it's like a spiritual democracy type of paradigm. All souls, like the Constitution tells us, that are created equal. So yoga begins with the idea that every soul is part and parcel of God, without exception, and that the cultural, racial, gender, the upadhis, the temporary material designations that we are born in, have nothing to do with our qualification spiritually to practice these eternal principles. So yoga is a spiritual science that was thought of as something that transcends things like caste, creed, race, religion, etc. So you have to understand that historically. It's true that this appears in and through a specific location in the world. Like, it comes in this philosophy comes in flowers through India. But that's just like some trees grow in certain parts of the world, right? Some fruits are only available in certain parts of the world, but it does not mean that only the people that live in that region can eat that fruit. Anyone can eat that fruit, anyone who has a mouth, right? So all souls that have ears to hear, hearts to see, souls to listen, can receive this eternal dharma, this eternal teaching, and can apply it, whether they're a woman in ancient caste system India, which would disqualify them, or they're an outcast, or whatever. That's the way that yoga was presented. That's the way that Bhakti Yoga was presented through the Gita. So in that sense, you have to remember that, first of all. And the second thing to remember is that it has always been the intention of the teachers who have held and carried this lineage, not at all different from Christian missionaries, to spread yoga to hurting people who are looking for spiritual enlightenment. Now, in comparing, obviously, to missionaries, I know that that's going to raise some red flags for people, because obviously missionary tactics of Christians have oftentimes been very brutal. And by and large, the transmission of yoga to the West has been very peaceful, right? So it's not been a militant thing, but it's been all of the teachers who brought yoga to the West did so because they believed that what they were teaching was eternal dharma, meant for all people in all circumstances and all places, that anyone could use this technology. Mantra is a technology, it's a medicine, it's a spiritual medicine that would be no different from saying, just because you're not from China doesn't mean you can't use acupuncture, doesn't mean you can't use Ayurveda. It doesn't mean that you can't be treated by a shamanic herbal medicine from Scandinavia. You know what I mean? So the view also that yogic practitioners have taken is that yes, we have mantras, they're in Sanskrit. We have sacred texts, they're in Sanskrit. We have deities and, collections of divine pastimes from these deities that come from a specific, cultural condition, but they are the essence of them, right, is what matters. And what they teach us about eternal truth, about the soul, about God, and these techniques that they give us for connecting the heart and soul to God are for everyone. And that is how the Bhakti Yoga that I practice came to the West, right? Through a succession of teachers that said, go take this everywhere. And that's how yoga has been for a long time in India. So you have to respect how the people who brought yoga to the West actually feel about yoga and what yoga says that it is. And that it is not something that, in other words, one way that I would just kind of almost like go the other way with the challenge of appropriation and saying it's actually in some ways more of a kind of cultural superiority complex in some ways, to think to ourselves that an Indian spiritual that the spiritual technology is Indian and not universal, even when the people and practitioners who practice it say that it is. That we're trying to label what it is. No, that's just Indian. No, that's just Hindu. Well, that's not what they say that it is. So if we're doing that, that's more of the imperialist intellectual mindset impressing itself upon something, when that's not what the history or the practitioners actually tell us that it is. That doesn't mean that we can't appropriate and disrespect a tradition. For example, getting Om tattooed, on your body in a way that's trying to be sexually provocative or sell products or something like that. There's lots of ways of cheapening and degrading and making offenses against these spiritual teachings. But if an intention is there to utilize these spiritual teachings with integrity and with substance, then it is not at all offensive. And that's what I've learned from my teachers, and also from being completely surrounded, absorbed, and deeply accepted and loved by my Indian brothers and sisters, my Indian bodied brothers and sisters. But we're all spirit souls. I'm not Indian. I'm not Indian, but I'm also not white, straight, male European. I'm that temporarily. I am that in this lifetime. But the yogic tradition says that we've had lifetimes beyond our capability of counting, and that we've been everything imaginable, you know? So, and that's not to say that we don't still have to deal with, that we eliminate or get rid of important distinctions about different places that people are coming from, different prejudices that people experience, different privileges that other groups have. The material world is filled with all sorts of power hierarchies where people are just trying to dominate one another, and we're born into different places within those hierarchies. And the point of yoga is to not be identified with them. And what we have to realize is that to a certain extent, the more that even the more that we try to sort out and make all of these different groups equal, that's not going to happen. The yogic scriptures are very clear that the reason that we practice yoga is because this world is a constant struggle for dominance and hoarding of resources and greed and lust, and that's not something that we can try to do our best to make the world a better place, and we should. That's our dharma. Part of our dharma is to love others and to love the world and to make it a better place. But we have to remember that the impetus to do so is not ultimately coming from the utopian idea, that fantasy that everything in this material world can ever be equal. The place that we find that equality is on the level of the spirit soul. So we chop wood, carry water, we do our work in the world, we try to make it a better place, while recognizing that our goal is not to make equality happen on a material level. It is to realize its eternal existence on the spiritual plane. And on that plane, the Gita and other, like the Bhagavatam, they also tell us that this eternal dharma, the science of yoga, appears in different times, places, and circumstances all around the universe. That God comes in, innumerable avatar forms to remind us of these eternal teachings, and they take on the shape of many other different spiritual practices that are essentially getting at the same thing. And Krishna tells us that in the Gita too. He talks about the way that he basically reciprocates in the way that people worship him. So, and my guru's guru once was asked, is there any difference between a bhakti yogi and a devoted Christian? And he said, no difference. So so the trappings culturally that teachings come through different temporary changing material circumstances is because we're in the material world. But we have to be respectful of those and get to know those on a certain level, because it's good to know the land where a special fruit grows. So for me, it has felt alienating at times. It's like, I'm not an Indian bodied person. I'm like a white European straight male bodied person, or whatever, whatever the case might be. But to me, learning about the different ways in which like Indian culture has decorated or adorned the essence of these eternal teachings, to me has been very beautiful. There's some things that are really going to just remain foreign to me because they're not a part of my own cultural lineage. But one thing that was really important that I've had to come to terms with, because the specific practice in the question that this person wrote, they said, because the specific practice doesn't come from my cultural lineage, I feel like I'm appropriating what doesn't belong to me or my heritage. But the thing is that heritage and culture also don't belong to us. They come through us, but they don't belong to us, just like children. And that's something that, my teachers and again, all of my Indian bodied community has reiterated to me time and time again as I've needed help with that, has been like, look, nothing in this material world is mine. Not my culture, not my body, not my skin color, not my race, not my creed, not my culture. None of it is actually mine. It's something that is all, I'm a witness to it. My karma has brought me into certain expressions of these flowering seasons in the material cosmos, but they are, they are not who we are. They are what we experience. And so it's really important not to be identified from the yogic standpoint with me and my, I, me, my. You remember that song? I, me, my, I, me, my, I, me, my. And those words in particular tend to be conducive of illusion for us. Functionally, we have to use them, but we have to understand it's not my money, right? It's not my house. It's not my body. It's not, I don't possess any of it because it passes out of my hands no matter what I do to try to hold on. It just eventually passes. George Harrison's album, all things must pass. I think that was the name of his All Things Pass, something like that. So that's the same attitude that the actual keepers of this tradition take toward culture. And if we want to be respectful of them while participating in it, then we have to realize that it in a sense it's more offensive to tell these people, well, you ought to be possessive of your culture and you're not, or I can't participate because that's your culture. It's actually a kind of trying to it's just, again, it's trying to tell someone something about their culture that isn't true. Like that's not actually true. That's not an actual true thing about yogic culture, that yogic culture says this is my heritage. um, Otherwise I wouldn't be here, and there wouldn't be temples all over the world that came specifically because the teachings of the tradition say that that's exactly not what we are. So it's a paradox, because at the same time there's going to be expressions of a specific time, place, and circumstance that come through the way in which the eternal teachings are expressed, but they are for everyone. So yeah, there's another analogy that's sometimes used, which is like a well. It's like if you want to get water, you've got to dig deep in one direction to get to a well. So there is also something about, like, it is inevitable that at some point, whether it's the culture I'm familiar with or one that I'm not familiar with, taking on yogic practice in the universal sense is probably going to require that we dig deep at some point into a particular direction. And for many of us, that's going to mean alienation, because even though most of us might have grown up in the West, say, in a Christian, like Europeanized Christian tradition of some kind, or we may be cut off from 3 generations ago who were Scandinavian shamans or something. It's not going to be easy to connect to those roots for most of us, and even if we did, we might still feel alienated there. So there's something fundamentally alienating about Western materialist culture. Sometimes we brace ourselves from that by hiding in intellectualism, which is a good hideout. Like it helps us feel respectful and intelligent and observant and things like that. But when it comes to spiritual life, intellectualizing about ourselves and others through culture, through history, and it's very objectifying, and it often does not serve the real long-term deepening of spiritual practice. Like, we really have to often immerse ourselves in a spiritual practice that's going to include community, where we can feel alienated, that's going to involve different cultures and ethnicities and histories and things like that. And walking through that without feeling alienated is pretty much impossible from my experience. So it's just about how do you come to understand that some of those feelings of alienation are not only natural, but a beautiful part of how this universal truth blossoms in our own hearts. So I don't need to wear or pretend to be Indian, in other words, but I can also fall deeply in love with the way that these eternal teachings have come through Indian history and culture. Anyway, I'm rambling on now at this point, so I hope that this was useful. And by no means do I feel that any of this is like the final say. I'm just trying to articulate the things that I've understood so far from my teachers and from my community in Bhakti, and also just to encourage other people out there who might have been learning Bhakti from this channel or practicing mantra because you listen to my channel or whatever. My teachers have told me always to tell people that they are welcome. So, okay, that's what I've got for you guys. I hope that this was a good one. Feel free, if you have any questions, to email me, info@nightlightastrology.com. Put Bhakti question into the subject line. All right, take it easy, everyone. Hare Krishna.